In the spring of 1989, when the initial memorial gatherings of students in Tiananmen Square, located in the heart of Beijing, gradually began to take the form of a broad political and social movement. It was not limited merely to the memory of a deceased reformist leader, but rather factors such as inflation produced as a result of China's economic reforms, increasing inequality, the perception of governmental corruption, and the limited scope for political participation were all condensed into a single narrative, as a result of which an atmosphere came into being in which condolence turned into protest and protest turned into a national debate. The death in April 1989 of reformist communist leader Hu Yaobang provided an immediate catalyst for this process because he was seen among students and intellectual circles as a supporter of political openness and institutional transparency, and his removal in 1987 had already created disappointment within reformist circles. Therefore, after his death, memorial gatherings in fact became a symbolic form of political expression. At the same time, in the late 1980s, despite economic reforms, rising inflation and the rapid increase in prices in urban areas created unrest among the middle and lower classes, while university graduates faced uncertain employment prospects and changes in the system of privileges within state institutions created a feeling of insecurity among the working class. Consequently, the students' demands gradually gained the sympathy of urban workers, teachers, and government employees, which expanded the scope of the movement, and it was no longer limited to campus politics, but increasingly became a representative of urban social unrest. Along with this, allegations of corruption within the Communist Party, nepotism, and the concentration of wealth through influence affected the credibility of the political leadership, and among educated youth, the perception strengthened that although economic reforms had paved the way for development, their benefits were being distributed in an unequal manner at the global level as well. At the end of the 1980s, reform movements taking place in Eastern Europe and the Soviet bloc influenced Chinese students because experiments such as glasnost and perestroika created the impression that political reforms were also possible within a socialist system, and this comparative awareness highlighted the contradiction between economic openness and political restrictions within China, as a result of which demands such as freedom of expression, transparency, rule of law, and political accountability began to emerge in protest gatherings. In this entire process, it is noteworthy that the majority of the protesters demanded reforms within the same structure rather than the immediate abolition of the system, due to which the nature of the movement remained reformist instead of revolutionary, although the state leadership saw it as a risk of political instability. By May 1989, Tiananmen Square had taken the form of a continuous sit in where hunger strikes, speeches by student representatives, and displays of civilian support were observed, and during this time, differences within the Chinese leadership regarding how to deal with this crisis also began to become apparent, because some leaders were in favor of cooling the situation through negotiations and limited concessions, while hardline circles, considering it a movement challenging state authority, were in favor of immediate action. At this stage, General Secretary of the party personally met the protesters and appealed for ending the hunger strike and supported negotiations. However, Prime Minister Li Peng and other conservative leaders, considering this position weak, emphasized the protection of state authority, due to which the division within the leadership became further deep. During the negotiation process, student representatives put forward demands such as official recognition of the protest as lawful, investigation of corruption, and freedom of expression, while the government was reluctant to agree to major political reforms. As a result, mutual distrust increased, and the negotiations did not reach any concrete outcome. At the end of May, martial law was imposed in Beijing, and military units were sent toward the city, after which, on the night of June 3rd and 4th, 1989, the protest was ended through military action, and this moment came to be counted among the most controversial and sensitive events in modern Chinese history. Regarding the number of deaths, different estimates were presented because the Chinese government did not release complete figures. In official statements, a few hundred deaths were mentioned, while other sources claimed a much higher number. In some reports, the possibility of thousands of deaths was indicated, and human rights organizations spoke of hundreds or thousands of people being killed, while reports of thousands of people being injured, arrested, and later facing trials also emerged, due to which debate on the true nature of the event continued at the global level. Due to restrictions on information and media control, determining accurate figures remained difficult, and this ambiguity further increased the sensitivity of the event. There was strong global reaction to this action. Human rights organizations criticized the use of force against unarmed civilians, arrests, and restrictions on freedom of expression, while several Western countries suspended military cooperation with China, imposed bans on arms sales, and restricted exports of sensitive technology, which affected China's international reputation. The matter was also discussed in United Nations forums. However, due to China's permanent membership, no strong action was possible at the Security Council level, although diplomatic pressure and critical statements continued. This crisis was apparently an internal political confrontation, but its effects proved to be profound on China's future political direction, because afterward the leadership prioritized stability, limited the scope of large scale public protests, and adopted a strategy of presenting economic development as political legitimacy. As a result, in the 1990s, China moved toward a model in which economic openness and political control were maintained simultaneously, and this style of governance gradually became the foundation of the Chinese state structure in later periods. After the June 1989 crisis, the fundamental challenge facing the Chinese leadership was not merely the restoration of order, but also the reconstitution of political legitimacy, because after the use of state power, the party leadership had realized that if economic development, institutional stability, and social order were not advanced under an integrated strategy, internal unrest could re emerge. Therefore, in this context, while maintaining Deng Xiaoping's policy of reform and opening up and keeping political control strict and accelerating economic modernization, that combination emerged, which was later described as a shared characteristic of the Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao eras. Deng Xiaoping, although not formally the president or prime minister, still in the 1980s and early 1990s, his decisive position determined the direction in which China was to move toward economic expansion with political stability. Therefore, in the post Tiananmen decisions, his influence was prominent, and the leadership made it clear that economic reforms would continue, but there would be no movement toward a multi party political system. During Jiang Zemin's era, the first priority of the political system was to strengthen party authority, under which surveillance over state institutions, universities, media, and social organizations was expanded, while strengthening relations with the military leadership reiterated the principle that the armed forces are subordinate to the party, not merely an administrative branch of the state. This step after 1989 further organized the center of power and limited possible internal disagreements. During the same period, Western style democracy or multi party competition possibilities were clearly rejected, and instead the concept of socialist democracy was presented, in which consultation within the party, policy debate, and limited level consultative institutions' presence were considered alternative to the democratic process. Thus, the political system was also theoretically given a new clarification whose purpose was to maintain centralization of power despite reforms. In this same context, Jiang Zemin introduced the theory of the three represents, under which the Communist Party was defined not only as the representative of the working class and peasantry, but also of advanced productive forces, cultural trends, and the fundamental interests of the people. This theoretical expansion provided space for the private business class, professional experts, and urban middle class to join the party. As a result, those emerging economic classes, which could potentially become political opposition, began to become part of the governmental structure, and thus the system developed the competence to transform economic change into political stability. During this same period, the rules of leadership transition became relatively clearer. Age limits, tenure rules, and collective leadership principles reduced the possibilities of personal rule and strengthened a bureaucratic style of governance, which made power transfer relatively predictable and limited the possibility of conflict among internal factions. At the administrative level, in the 1990s, the Chinese state moved from revolutionary style governance toward a modern bureaucratic structure. The number of central ministries was reduced, state institutions were merged, and in many sectors, state control was transformed from direct administrative intervention into regulatory supervision. As a result, state owned enterprises were given partial autonomy, and ministries took on policymaking and oversight roles instead of running factories, and thus the foundation of a regulatory economy rather than a planned economy was laid. During the same period, civil service examinations, training programs, and merit based promotion systems were strengthened, due to which technocrats with engineering, economics, and administrative skills began to become prominent at various levels of leadership, and thus the Chinese state developed a professional administrative class capable of systematically advancing rapid economic change. When Hu Jintao assumed leadership in 2002, China's economy was rapidly growing, but the same speed had also created new problems of regional inequality, rural urban divide, and social unrest. Therefore, during his era, the concept of a harmonious society emerged, whose purpose was to balance the fruits of development, increase rural health facilities, reduce poverty, and ensure the expansion of education. Although no fundamental change occurred in the political system, the governance style included complaint handling systems, limited local level elections, and partial measures of administrative transparency, and thus the state adopted a strategy of strict control with limited responsiveness. During the same period, in the evaluation of local officials' performance, instead of only GDP growth, factors such as social stability, environment, and public satisfaction were also included, which led to a gradual change in administrative priorities, and the state began to give importance to social balance along with economic development. In 2003, the SARS crisis and natural disasters highlighted the need to improve the state response system, resulting in the strengthening of emergency administrative structures, somewhat opening of information exchange in the public health sector, and introduction of online government platforms, which simultaneously strengthened administrative efficiency and state supervision. Thus, the initial structure of digital governance began to emerge in this period. Along with this, e governance, complaint portals, and online administrative services introduced new methods of contact between citizens and the state, which increased state capacity and improved bureaucratic efficiency. The state's attitude toward participants in the 1989 protests and affected families was based on gradual social integration rather than formal reconciliation. Despite arrests and surveillance in the early years, over time many students were allowed to continue their education, go abroad, and pursue professional lives. As a result, they became integrated into the new economic system, and political tensions gradually decreased. Economic development played an important role in this process because in the 1990s and 2000, the creation of new employment opportunities, private business possibilities, and the expansion of the urban middle class created an environment in which political conflict was replaced by economic opportunity, and thus reconciliation took place through economic development rather than political reform. The families affected by the protests of 1989, particularly those of victims who were killed, injured, or detained, were not officially recognized, but limited private memorial activities were allowed while public discussion of this event remained restricted. This strategy helped the state maintain social stability without reopening the past, and the new generation that had not directly experienced 1989 was more influenced by the narrative of economic success and urban development, which strengthened party legitimacy in a new form. During this entire period, China rapidly integrated into the global economy. Accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001 increased exports, industrial production expanded, and China emerged as a global manufacturing center, which gave internal stability and economic legitimacy, and the leadership presented development as the fundamental pillar of political legitimacy. Thus, the period from 1989 to 2012 becomes a transitional phase in which China simultaneously advanced political continuity, economic expansion, and administrative modernization. And although there was no democratic transformation in the political system, institutional stability, a professional bureaucracy, the rise of the middle class, and economic growth strengthened the state structure. As a result, China not only became internally stable but also emerged globally as an emerging power, and this foundation continued to enable later leadership to move toward more centralized authority and a greater global role. After 2012, when China's political leadership entering a new phase brought Xi Jinping forward as the General Secretary of the Communist Party and later as the state president, this was not merely a change of leadership, but along with it also included a clear movement toward centralization of power in the concept of state power, institutional balance, and internal and external strategy. Because by the end of Hu Jintao's era, although economic development and administrative stability had become strong, concerns of corruption, regional inequality, and fragmentation in state institutions had led the leadership to the conclusion that without more centralized and stronger leadership, long term stability would no longer be possible. Therefore, this rise took place in such a political environment where, along with reforms, control, order, and political coherence, were again being given central importance. With Xi Jinping coming into power, the process of concentration of power within the state structure began rapidly because he significantly increased the role of central party committees in various sectors of the party military, judiciary, media, and economy and further strengthened the principle that state institutions are subordinate to party leadership instead of their autonomy. This change made clear the model of Chinese governance in which political centralization was given priority over institutional autonomy. At the same time, a broad anti corruption campaign was launched, which not only affected thousands of officials but also weakened various informal factions within the party. And through metaphors such as tigers and flies, it was made clear that the scope of accountability extends to every level, which apparently increased administrative transparency, but in practice further strengthened central leadership. In this period, an ideological evolution also emerged by incorporating Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era into the party constitution, which gave Xi not only an administrative but also an intellectual central position, and thus he emerged after Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong as a leader of that level whose name became associated with an ideological framework. This process strengthened ideological coherence within the party and further increased the central importance of political loyalty. At the same time, nationalism, state security, and political order were linked with the development narrative through which the legitimacy of the Communist Party became associated not only with economic development but also with the concept of national rejuvenation and global status. At the economic level, during Xi's era, an attempt was made to change the model in which emphasis was shifted from export based growth toward domestic demand, technology, and innovation, which is viewed in the context of supply side structural reform. Through this policy, efforts were made to reduce excess industrial production, manage debt burdens, and improve the performance of state owned enterprises, while state investment increased in sectors such as artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and digital infrastructure, through which an attempt was made to move China's economy toward a more technology based model. At the same time, projects of poverty reduction in rural areas and improvement of basic infrastructure were also accelerated, the purpose of which was to reduce regional inequality and maintain social stability. In the field of foreign policy, Xi Jinping's era is seen as a notable change because China moved away from the previous strategy of hide and bide toward a more active and globally influential policy, in which the concept of the Chinese dream, meaning national rejuvenation, gained central importance, and China increased its presence in the United Nations, regional organizations, and development institutions, which created the impression that China is now not just a regional power but an important actor participating in shaping the global system. In this context, the Belt and Road Initiative was launched, which sought to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe through infrastructure, ports, railways, and energy projects, and through it, China not only increased economic influence but also reorganized diplomatic relations in a new manner. In the field of security and military affairs during Xi's era, China paid special attention to modernizing its defense capabilities, which included an increase in naval power, development of cyber and space technology, and production of advanced missile systems, while through reforms in the military structure, the old regional command system was transformed into more integrated theater commands, which increased the operational capability of the military and further strengthened central control. At the same time, in space technology, the completion of the Beidou navigation system and development of anti satellite capabilities brought China to a new level of strategic autonomy, while military and technological cooperation with Russia further complicated the balance of global powers. In the field of soft power and global narrative, China attempted to increase its influence through cultural diplomacy, media networks, and educational programs, which included Confucius Institutes, development aid, and international media platforms, so that in global public opinion, an image of China as a positive and development oriented power could be strengthened. At the same time, in the field of climate change and global governance, China also played an active role, which included investment in renewable energy and targets of carbon neutrality, through which it became evident that China wants to establish its place as a responsible power in the global institutional system. Despite all these changes, the most prominent feature of Xi Jinping's era is the movement of state power towards centralization and the extraordinary consolidation of discipline within the party, because expansion in anti corruption, ideological control, digital surveillance, and national security has made the state structure more integrated but more centralized, which on one hand accelerated decision making but on the other hand limited institutional diversity. And thus China moved towards such a model where economic development, political centralization, and global influence became interconnected with each other. Thus, the political journey starting from 1989, in which initially public protests, then institutional stability, and later technocratic development were included in Xi Jinping's era, transformed into a more centralized, ideologically integrated, and globally active state model. And this same evolution forms that shape of modern China, which is today playing a decisive role in global politics, economy, and balance of power.